It's harder for me to go. Every morning's like Christmas to me to think about, ooh, I wonder what Santa brought me last night.
Most people think they know Tom Oar, the quiet mountain man on their TV screen, the guy tanning hides in a remote Montana cabin while the rest of the world scrolls through their phones. But here's what nobody told you. The man who preached total self-reliance, the man who built his own home from scratch and refused to let the modern world in, had an entire room on his property that the cameras were never allowed inside. A garage. And when people finally got a look at what was in it, the story of Tom Oar stopped being what anyone thought it was. The man nobody fully knew. Before we get to what was found, you need to understand something about Tom Oar that most people who watched mountain men completely missed, and it changes everything. Tom was born in 1943 in Rockford, Illinois, not in Montana, not in the wilderness, in a Midwestern town, to a father who had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and came home to work as a horseman and entertainer with the U.S. Wild West shows. By the time Tom and his brother Jack were 7 years old, their father had already taught them both to trick ride, performing stunts on the backs of running horses. Most kids that age were learning to read. Tom was learning how to stay on a galloping animal doing handstands. That appetite for risk followed him straight into the rodeo circuit at 15. His mother drove him to the edge of town, handed him his bull rope and rigging bag, and he hitchhiked to Ohio alone to ride bulls and bucking horses for money. No safety net, no backup plan. He just went. By the early 1960s, Tom had climbed the ranks of the International Rodeo Association and was consistently placing in the top 10, making it to the finals year after year. He rode bulls for 18 years and bucking horses for 25. Those aren't soft numbers. That's a career built on one of the most dangerous sports that exists. He qualified for the International Finals Rodeo 8 times. Then, Valentine's Day, 1970. Tom climbed onto a bull named Woolly Bugger. The chute opened, the bull erupted, and their heads collided. Tom went unconscious. His hand was still locked in the rope, and his body was pinned under the animal's hind legs for 2 full minutes, while Woolly Bugger kept bucking and stepping on him. He came out on a stretcher and didn't regain consciousness for 3 hours. Severe concussion, bruising across most of his body. The bull, for what it's worth, died 2 weeks later. Tom used to say, with a straight face, that he thinks he gave Woolly Bugger a concussion too. He went back to the rodeo 1 month after that, but he never got back to where he'd been. In 1981, he retired from the sport entirely. He was 38 years old, had ridden bulls and broncs his whole adult life, and now needed to figure out what came next. What came next was Montana, and a decision that would define the rest of his life. He and his wife Nancy packed everything into an old pickup truck and drove north. They had some friends in the area around Troy, Montana. They bought 1.5 acres of land with a small 2-room cabin on it, and Tom bought a chainsaw, not to decorate a wall, but to start cutting timber for a house. It took them 5 years to build it by hand. 5 years of cutting, stacking, fitting, and finishing while living in that little starter cabin. When it was done, they moved in and didn't leave for decades. For their first 17 years in the Yaak River Valley, there was no electricity, no running water. Nancy carried 5-gallon pails from the well. The nearest grocery store was 50 miles away. Their community, tucked inside 2.2 million acres of Kootenai National Forest, had around 250 people in it, and most of those only showed up in summer. In winter, it was just the oars, the snow, and whatever the forest provided. Tom had some experience trapping from his Illinois days, but he didn't know how to make real money from it out here. That changed when he and Nancy stopped into a Native American store in Billings. On a shelf, almost by accident, he found a 16-page book about how Native Americans brain tan hides. It cost $3. He bought it, took it home, and it changed everything. Brain tanning is one of the oldest methods of turning an animal hide into soft, wearable leather. You flesh the hide, scraping every last piece of meat and fat from it by hand. You soak it, dehair it, then work the brain of the animal into the hide over and over, stretching and manipulating it for up to 30 minutes at a time, so the oils penetrate deep into the fibers. Then you soften it while it dries, stretching, cabling, smacking the hide to keep the fibers moving until it becomes something that feels almost like cloth. The final step is smoking it, which locks in the softness so it doesn't stiffen back up when it gets wet. Skip any one of these steps and you end up with rawhide. Do them all correctly and you end up with something commercial leather simply cannot replicate. Tom described it once by saying, "You could hold it up to your lips and blow through it. That's how soft and breathable it becomes." This was the craft he built his life around. Not the TV show, not the fame. The craft came first, by decades. The show came later. What the cameras did and didn't show. Mountain Men premiered on the History Channel in 2012. Tom Oar was already closing in on 70 years old when the cameras showed up, and he'd been living this way for over 30 years by then. Viewers got to watch him trap, tan, hunt, and make things with his hands in ways that most people in the modern world had completely forgotten existed. He became the breakout figure of the show almost immediately. What the cameras did show was impressive enough. Tom setting trap lines for bobcats, martens, weasels, and wolves across the frozen landscape around the Yak River. Tom scraping and working hides on his fleshing beam until they were ready to be turned into buckskin. Nancy stitching and sewing beside him, the two of them operating as a complete unit. Tom crafting knives with handles made from deer antler and bone, building functional bows from carefully selected wood using methods passed down through generations, making tomahawks and flint tools, actual primitive technology, not for display, but for use. None of Tom's products were made with machines, not a single item from a sewing machine. Every stitch, every edge, every seam was by hand. His knives went for around $250 each at rendezvous and trading posts. His buckskin shirts, jackets, and pants, made entirely from hides he tanned himself, were pieces that collectors actively sought out. His moccasins were made from deer, elk, or buffalo hide and were designed to breathe, so your feet stayed dry in the field. His beaded sheaths were hand-stitched and decorated with traditional patterns. Before the show came along, Tom and Nancy would go to 1 or 2 black powder rendezvous events a year, reenactments of the 1840s fur trade era, where people dressed in period clothing, traded goods, and competed in traditional skills. Tom would spend the months leading up to each rendezvous working full-time to build up enough inventory to sell. At each event, he and Nancy would typically bring in between $3,000 and $4,000. That was their income. That was their life. Mountain Men changed the scale of it. More people found out about Tom's work. Orders picked up. Fans started showing up at the cabin. Over 300 people in a single summer came to his property in the middle of the Kootenai National Forest to shake his hand and take photographs. Tom, by his own admission, wasn't thrilled about that part. He hadn't moved to the Montana wilderness to become a celebrity. He'd moved there because he believed deeply that he was born somewhere between 150 and 200 years too late. The frontier life wasn't a performance for him. It was his actual preference for how a person should spend their time on Earth. What the cameras showed less of, what the show touched on but never fully explored, was Tom's workspace. His garage, the outbuilding on his property where the actual work happened, where hides were processed, tools were stored, and projects were built from nothing. That space told a story that a few minutes of edited television footage could never fully capture. And it's what people who have visited the property over the years still talk about. The garage. What was actually inside? This is the part people wanted to know about. The garage on Tom Oar's property is not a garage in the way most people picture one. There's no car oil on the floor, no shelving units from a big box store, no power tools plugged into the wall. What it is, instead, is a working museum of a craft that almost nobody else on Earth still practices at this level. And the more you understand about what each item in that space actually does, the more the whole picture comes into focus. Start with the hides. At any given time during Tom's active seasons, the space held animal hides in various stages of the tanning process, some staked out and drying on wooden frames, some in the process of being fleshed, some already soft and folded waiting to be cut and sewn. Deer hides, elk hides, buffalo hides, each one representing hours of physical labor before it became usable material. The fleshing beam, a smooth, angled log that Tom worked hides against to scrape them clean, was one of the central pieces of the workspace. It wasn't decorative. It showed the wear of thousands of hours of use. Properly fleshing a deer hide by hand takes most skilled tanners between 1 and 2 hours. Tom was doing multiple hides per week during peak season. The math adds up fast. A buffalo hide is a different challenge entirely. A full adult bison hide can weigh 60 pounds or more before it's been processed, and every pound of that has to be fleshed, soaked, worked with brain solution, stretched, cabled, and smoked. Tom's workspace had the rigging to handle hides at that scale. Large wooden frames, strong rope, and the physical tools to manipulate material that most people couldn't even lift in its raw state. The fact that he was still processing buffalo hides well into his 70s says something about the kind of physical condition he maintained. The knife collection alone was something worth stopping to look at. Tom made knives in the traditional mountain man style, high-carbon steel blades paired with handles carved from deer antler, elk antler, and bone. Each knife came with a hand-stitched buckskin sheath, often decorated. These were working knives, not display pieces, though people bought them as both. Alongside the steel knives were the stone tools, obsidian and flint blades that Tom knapped himself. He preferred stone knives specifically for skinning animals. The reason was practical and smart. A stone blade, properly knapped, holds an edge that's actually sharper than surgical steel at the microscopic level, and it doesn't accidentally punch through the hide the way a steel blade can if your hand slips. For a man whose income depended on the quality of the hides he pulled off animals, that distinction mattered every single time. The tomahawks were another category entirely. Tom forged and assembled traditional hawk-style hatchets, the kind that mountain men of the 1840s carried as a primary tool for camp work, fire starting, and close defense. His versions were functional and period-accurate, with hand-forged steel heads and hand-shaped wooden handles. At black powder rendezvous events, tomahawk throwing was a competitive discipline, and Tom's pieces were built to perform under that kind of use, not just to hang on a wall. The bows were something else entirely. Tom crafted traditional archery equipment from carefully selected wood, shaping and tillering each bow by hand to achieve the right balance of draw weight and flex. Tillering is the process of bending and scraping a bow stave to create an even arc across both limbs. A bow with uneven limbs will torque on release and fly unpredictably. It takes patience and a precise eye. The arrows were fletched by hand as well, with natural feather fletchings split and trimmed to match. These weren't decorative. Tom used them, and he expected the people who bought them to use them too. The leatherwork tools filled their own section of the space. Awls for punching holes through thick buckskin, bone needles alongside steel ones, edge tools for trimming and beveling leather before stitching, the softening cables used to work hides during the drying phase, lengths of cable looped through a fixed point that Tom would run the hide back and forth over, keeping the fibers moving as the leather dried so they wouldn't lock up stiff. Buckets for the brain solution, a smoking setup for the final stage of tanning. Typically a small enclosed space where Tom would suspend a hide over smoldering rotten wood, the smoke penetrating the fibers and chemically binding with the oils already worked into the hide, locking the softness in permanently. A brain-tanned hide that has been properly smoked will wash soft. One that hasn't been smoked will dry stiff as a board the moment it gets wet. There were also the trapping supplies, leg hold traps, conibear traps, and the wire, stakes, and tools for setting and checking a trap line in deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. Tom ran trap lines for bobcats, martens, weasels, and wolves across the land around his cabin, checking them daily during the season. The pelts from those animals fed directly back into his work, more material to process, more inventory to build, more product to bring to rendezvous or sell through the Willow Bend trading post in Troy, which became the primary authorized outlet for his finished pieces. A bobcat pelt, properly processed, could become the trim on a coat or hat. A marten pelt might become a small pouch or decorative accent. Nothing was wasted. And then there were the pieces already in progress. Half-finished moccasins with the upper and lower sections cut but not yet joined. Partially sewn jackets with the buckskin laid out and marked, waiting for the next session of hand-stitching. Medicine bags decorated with glass trade beads in traditional geometric patterns. Belt bags with fringe cut and edges finished, but not yet assembled. Each piece represented hours of work already done, and hours more still to come. The average brain-tanned buckskin shirt, from raw hide to finished garment, requires somewhere between 40 and 80 hours of labor when you factor in the full tanning process. Every stitch placed by hand. What hit people who actually got to see this space wasn't just the quantity of it, or even the quality. It was the realization that this was a one-man operation, one man and his wife, producing work at a level that entire small companies would struggle to match. In the middle of the Montana wilderness, without electricity for the first 17 years, 50 miles from a grocery store, in a climate that regularly pushed toward brutal cold. The health scare, the pressure, and what nearly ended it all. Tom Oar had spent his entire adult life in situations that should have broken him. A bull nearly killed him at 35. He rebuilt a life from scratch in a Montana wilderness at 38. He lived without electricity or running water for 17 years. By the time mountain men began airing, he was approaching 70 and still dragging logs, running trap lines in knee-deep snow, and processing hides by hand. He'd told American Cowboy magazine plainly. He kept telling Nancy that one day she'd probably find him stretched out dead over the fleshing block. He said it like it was the right way to go. The thing that made the health scare so significant wasn't just that it happened, it's that Tom Oar was one of the last people alive you would ever expect it to happen to. Season 11 of Mountain Men changed the tone of everything. Episode 4, titled Heart and Soul, opened with something that had never happened to Tom Oar in his life. A medical emergency he couldn't work through. He woke up in the middle of the night, unable to catch his breath. Nancy knew immediately that something was wrong, not because Tom complained, because Tom never complained, but because he agreed to see a doctor. That was the tell. Tom Oar agreeing to make an 80-mile trek to the nearest clinic in Libby, Montana, in the middle of a season meant the situation was serious. The clinic in Libby was not a large hospital. It was the closest option. In the Yaak River Valley, that's the reality of medical care. You plan around the distance, and you don't go unless you have to. The tests confirmed it. Fluid was settling in his lungs because his heart wasn't pumping with enough strength, a condition called congestive heart failure, where the heart's reduced efficiency causes fluid to back up into the lungs and surrounding tissue. A man who had never had a health problem in his life was suddenly wearing a defibrillator vest as a precaution, while doctors monitored whether medication alone could stabilize his condition or whether more aggressive intervention would be required. Nancy, on camera, said that this heart condition was a whole new look on life for Tom. The man who had ridden Woolly Bugger, who had rebuilt his life twice, had finally met something he couldn't outwork or outlast through sheer stubbornness. What made this harder was the isolation. The Yaak River Valley doesn't have a nearby cardiac unit. It doesn't have a specialist on call down the road. Managing a heart condition in that environment required a level of logistical planning that sat uncomfortably against everything Tom had built his life around. The self-sufficient mountain man now had medication schedules, monitoring requirements, and follow-up appointments that pulled him toward civilization whether he wanted to go or not. This health crisis arrived on top of pressure that had been building for years. Tom's children from his first marriage, Chad and his daughter Keely, had been encouraging him to retire and move to Florida since before the show even started. Chad had grown up spending Christmases and summers at the Montana cabin and understood exactly what the life required. He knew the cold, the isolation, the physical demands of daily work in that climate. He wanted his father somewhere warmer and with easier access to medical care. Keely, who had moved to Florida in 1986 and built her life there, echoed the same concern. Keely passed away on April 26, 2015, in St. Petersburg, Florida. She was 49 years old. The family kept the details private. It was the hardest loss of Tom's life. A parent losing a child is a weight that doesn't lift. He kept going. He always kept going. But you can't understand the full picture of Tom Oar's later years on Mountain Men without knowing that he was carrying that grief alongside everything else. He never made it the subject of the show. He never turned it into content. He just absorbed it and kept working, because that was the only language he had for coping with anything difficult. The show kept filming. Tom and Nancy began spending winters in Florida as a practical concession to his health, something the tabloid circuit immediately turned into retirement announcements, which Nancy publicly and firmly corrected. She told the local Montana paper directly, "They love Montana. They are not going anywhere." The distinction mattered to both of them. Wintering somewhere warmer is not the same as quitting. Tom continued to appear through seasons 12 and 13, though with reduced frequency. There were episodes where he appeared briefly, and the production team was visibly working around his energy levels and medical needs. His co-stars on the show noticed the change too. Eustace Conway, one of the most vocal about Tom's character off-camera, had described him publicly as one of the steadiest, most grounded men he'd met through the show. Marty Maiorato, who had his own chapter of serious hardship during the show's run, spoke about how Tom's presence in the early seasons set a tone of quiet competence that the rest of the cast measured themselves against. Watching that version of Tom slow down, even slightly, even understandably, hit differently for people who knew what he had been. The question the show kept circling was one that Tom had answered quietly with every day he showed up to work. At what point does a man who has defined himself entirely by his self-reliance and physical capability accept that the capability is changing? What it all actually meant, and what's left behind. Here's the thing about Tom Oar that gets lost when people turn him into a character. Either the noble mountain man, or the eccentric survivalist, or the stubborn old man who won't move to Florida. The actual story is both simpler and more interesting than any of those versions. And the garage is the proof of it, because you can't fake what was in that room. You can't manufacture 40 years of wear on a fleshing beam. You can't stage a workspace where every tool is the right tool for a specific step in a specific process that almost no one else alive still knows how to do. Tom Oar was a man who found a $3 book in a store in Billings, Montana in the early 1980s and decided to master what was in it. That book described a craft that Native American peoples had practiced for thousands of years, and that virtually nobody in the modern world still knew how to do properly. Brain tanning, the process of using the natural oils in an animal's own brain to turn its raw hide into soft, breathable, durable leather without a single chemical. He read it, practiced it, failed at it, got better at it, practiced more, and never stopped. He was still refining his process decades after he started. Over 40 years in the Yak River Valley, he became arguably the best living practitioner of that craft in North America. That's not a title anyone awarded him. It's a conclusion that follows from the evidence, the volume of work he produced, the quality collectors and buyers consistently reported, and the simple fact that virtually no one else was doing it at his scale and consistency. The buckskin he produced was genuinely different from anything commercially available. Softer, more breathable, more durable, with a warmth retention and moisture resistance that commercial chrome-tanned leather simply cannot replicate. People who wore his moccasins said their feet didn't sweat. People who wore his jackets and shirts said they moved differently than any other leather garment they'd owned. That difference is real, and it's chemical. It comes from the animal's own brain oils being worked permanently into the hide's fiber structure, rather than a factory chemical bath that mimics some but not all of the same effects. The pricing tells part of the story. Tom's knives went for around $250 each. His brain-tanned buckskin shirts, representing somewhere between 40 and 80 hours of total labor when you count the full tanning process, sold for prices that were, by any commercial standard, far below what the labor alone would justify. He wasn't pricing his work like a luxury artisan. He was pricing it like a mountain man at a rendezvous, because that's what he was, and that's the market he had built his life around. As his profile grew from mountain men, the gap between what he charged and what people would have paid became more visible. Collectors started watching for his pieces specifically. The Willow Bend Trading Post in Troy, Montana, the only authorized place to purchase his work, became a destination for people who understood what they were looking at. His handmade items started appearing at resale for multiples of what he originally charged. A signed obsidian knife with a deer antler handle and a brain-tanned buffalo hide sheath, an object Tom made the way people made things 200 years ago, using techniques that predate the United States as a country, became the kind of piece that serious collectors track down and hold on to. The irony isn't lost on anyone who thought carefully about Tom's relationship with money and fame. He spent decades making things as far from the commercial world as possible, and the commercial world eventually came to him and put a premium on exactly that. Tom Oar's estimated net worth at the time of his reduced appearances on the show was around $300,000 to $400,000. For a man who spent 17 years without electricity, who carried water in 5-gallon pails, who still doesn't use a sewing machine, that number says something about the compounding value of genuine skill practiced consistently over time. He built it one hide, one knife, one moccasin at a time, selling at rendezvous events for $3,000 to $4,000 a pop across decades, supplemented eventually by what History Channel paid him for mountain men. It was never a fortune, but it was entirely built with his own hands, on his own terms, in a valley he chose because he wanted to live a certain kind of life. That's a rare alignment between values and outcome. The sign above the door of Tom Oar's cabin in the Yaak River Valley reads, "He is free who lives as he chooses." That wasn't decoration. It was a statement of intent, and he had been living it before he ever put it on a sign. The man who built that cabin from trees he cut himself, who learned to tan hides from a 16-page pamphlet he found by accident in a Billings store, who rode bulls for 18 years and walked away to build something quieter and harder and more lasting. He lived by that sentence every single day, not as a performance, not for an audience. He lived it in the work, in the tools, in the choices he made about what his time on Earth was for. The garage is what that sentence looks like in practice. Not a monument, not a museum, not a TV set. A working room full of tools that still have use in them, hides at various stages of becoming something. The smell of smoke and pine and brain solution and 40 years of serious physical work. That's what was actually inside. No mysteries, no secrets. Just the accumulated evidence of a man who decided what mattered to him early and never once stopped doing it. What are your thoughts about Tom Oar's garage? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.